A home lab is the sum of two parts, the software stack you run and the hardware you choose to run it on. Now, I've already done a tour of my home lab as it pertains to the hardware I'm running, so today we're going to do another tour. This time it'll be more virtual as we take a look at everything I'm running from Unified Network, Proxmox, TrueNAS, Synology, LocalAI, Docker, Kubernetes, and all kinds of goodies and treats. If this gets your jimmies rustling, then buckle up, because here we go. Let's start at the top with networking. I run all external services I'm hosting through Cloudflare, and I'm using their load balancer so that in the event that one of my WANs goes down, my external services will still know where to go. For $5 a month, I think it's worth it. Speaking of dual WANs, I have AT&T Fiber and Xfinity both in pass-through mode feeding into my Unified Dream Machine Pro. This uses my AT&T as a primary and Xfinity as a backup. I'm running pretty much all Ubiquiti gear, so you can guess that Unified Network is my SDN. I was previously running all Ubiquiti switches and access points with a pfSense gateway, but I dove all the way into the Unified world by switching to a UDM Pro. I cover my full thoughts on this in a separate video, so I don't want to go in too much detail, but for the most part, I'd say it was a wash. Unified UI is certainly visually pleasing with plenty of nice graphics and pages to make you go ooh and ah, but we don't really care about that right now. What we do care about is what I'm actually doing with it. Let's take a look at how I use VLANs to separate my network into different pieces. I have a total of 6 VLANs, which may be a lot or very little depending on how thick your tinfoil hat is. I have my main LAN, then 5 different VLANs: guest, IoT, LAN 2, external, and Ceph. Most of my stuff lives on my main LAN since it's pretty much just me here. The guest VLAN is, you guessed it, for guests. This is the network everyone except me and my wife are on if they come over. The IoT VLAN is for, yep, wow, you guys are so smart, my IoT devices. This includes my security cameras, thermostat, sprinkler system, ring alarm, random smart plugs, stuff like that, which needs connection to the internet but doesn't really need to touch anything else on my network. LAN 2, okay, this may be a little harder to guess. I use this to separate my test Omada network from everything else. I have a little TP-Link Omada short stack running that I use to check Omada upgrades and stuff like that. So this is how I keep it my dirty little secret. I guess I probably could name it something better. The external VLAN is for my Kubernetes and Docker services that are used to expose things to the outside world. If you're exposing anything yourself, I strongly recommend that you throw that stuff in a specific VLAN and only allow it to communicate internally to devices that are absolutely necessary. I'll show you how I'm doing this in a bit. The last one is a VLAN for our Ceph cluster. This solely exists as a Ceph network and has no reason to communicate with any other devices as they only talk to each other anyway. I could probably get away with fewer VLANs, or I could be more anal and add more, but this works for me. Now, to make sure I know which VLANs are allowed to talk to each other, I have firewall rules set up, or traffic rules in the Unified Network. I'm honestly not a huge fan of how Unify handles firewall rules and inner VLAN rules, but my setup works, so whatever. Looking at my traffic rules, you'll see that they're in a random order, which is actually the order that they're created, not the order that they're processed. Unify seems to do blocking rules first, then allows. I have my external IoT and LAN 2 networks blocked from reaching out to anything. Then I have Ceph blocked to and from everything. Then everything blocked from reaching my main LAN. Then, since I want my main LAN to be able to reach out to other networks, I have an allow rule set up to let it do that. Then another allow rule to let my external network talk to my Ceph network. Over in the IP addresses section, I have a few specific allow rules that let my external network communicate with only specific devices on my LAN, rather than just opening up the whole thing. If you're wondering where the guest VLAN is, well, I have that marked as isolated, meaning that nothing can get in or out no matter what traffic rules you deploy. It would be nice to have the option of the traffic rules overriding this and obviously allow us to put the rules in the order we want, but I'm not holding my breath. The last thing I want to touch on is my VPN. I'm running OpenVPN server in Unified Network that allows me to connect back to my network when I'm out and about. It also lets me easily access remote devices that I deploy, as you'll see later in this video. I'll probably switch to WireGuard soon, as it is a good bit faster than OpenVPN, but I'm seeing some bugs in macOS at the moment, and as soon as those are fixed, we're switching. I'm also running OpenVPN client in Unify as well. I use PIA as my VPN of choice to route specific traffic through there. Right now, I have everything from the guest and IoT networks going through PIA, as well as my VPN virtual machine that I use for watching Pirates of the Caribbean on loop. Okay, that covers my network. I know there's plenty that I didn't cover, but this is a full home lab tour, so we gotta move on. If you want to see a full network walkthrough, then let me know down in the comments and maybe I'll make your dreams come true. Alrighty. Let's start with my main server, which has been the rock of my home lab for the last 3 years. It's running Proxmox, which you'll notice is a common theme here. I use this server as my powerhouse since it's by far the most powerful device in my lab, but I wouldn't really say I'm using it to its full potential. Proxmox host itself has 2 10 gigabit connections coming in. One is dedicated to my TrueNAS VM, and the other is for everything else. Speaking of TrueNAS, this is my main NAS operating system of choice. I have 12 terabyte drives that are connected to an LSI 9201 HBA card, then I'm passing that entire card through to TrueNAS. This prevents me from having to deal with individual drives, as that sounds like a pain. This isn't the only thing I'm passing through either. I also have a 40 gigabit Mellanox ConnectX-3 and an Asus Hyper M.2 card with 4 2 terabyte NVMe drives. The ConnectX-3 gives me a full 40 gigabit connection directly to my workstation PC and is extremely unnecessary, but most of my lab is. The NVMe drives are passed through individually though, since that is how they're seen by the host. I'm then utilizing them in a RAID Z1 pool to give me super fast network storage. Yes, I know this is bottlenecked by the network. Within TrueNAS, I'm not doing anything crazy. My main pool with these 12 terabyte drives is broken down into 3 separate RAID Z1 VDEVs. I'm also using 2 SSDs in a mirrored config as a metadata cache. It's been running great for years, no dead drives, great speeds, probably the most reliable piece in my home lab. My shares aren't anything to write home about either. I'm using SMB since all my shares need to be accessed by my Windows machine at some point, and I only have 3. 2 of them are on my main pool for media and then everything else. Then the other is on my NVMe pool. You'll notice that in my lab things may be a bit more simple since I'm literally the only one messing with stuff, which is probably different if you're used to working for small businesses or something. Now, how I back up my data from here may be a bit controversial as I'm using rsync. In a perfect world, you'd probably back up your ZFS system via snapshots and replication, but this ain't a perfect world. I just put out an entire video on how I back up my home lab, which I'll link down below, but at a high level, basically I replaced my ZFS backup server with a Synology system. Synology runs ButterFS, which does support snapshots and replication, just not from a ZFS system. Therefore, rsync. Okay, moving on to the next most important VM on my main server, my Ubuntu server VM running Docker. You noticed I'm running my stuff exclusively on VMs as opposed to LXC containers, which essentially just comes down to preference. I like working with VMs in a separate kernel from the host. If you like containers, then use containers. This Docker VM used to run pretty much everything in my home lab, but I've slowly started moving everything from there to my Proxmox cluster that you'll see in a bit. Right now, it's running Nextcloud, 2 Minecraft servers, Uptime Kuma, my little link page, and an Nginx load balancer. Nextcloud is pretty great, and I've actually started to use it for more than just cloud file storage. Turns out there's a whole suite of software in there, from Office, chat, video conferencing, organization, and even AI, which we do dabble in a bit. The Minecraft servers run on here since they can utilize the Epic CPU and 256 gigs of RAM a bit better than most other things. I currently have these deployed and backed up pretty manually with Docker Compose and cron jobs, but I do want to move them to Pterodactyl. So I'll probably be adding plenty of views to TechnoTim's video soon. Uptime Kuma runs on here and has absolutely zero reason to. It would make way more sense for the service that is making sure everything is running if it was running on my highly available cluster, so that'll be moved soon. Same thing with the LocalAI server, another Techno Tim shout out. It has no reason to run on here and is going to be moved. The Nginx load balancer is actually being moved as well, and I have it running in the HA cluster already just to make sure everything is good before sending this one down the old dusty trail. So yeah, a once bustling mecca of Docker services is now a ghost town, and that's okay. I did say we were dabbling in AI, and we are doing that through a self-hosted instance of LocalAI. It's running directly in an Ubuntu VM via Docker, and to spice it up, I'm passing through an RTX 2070 Super to give it some CUDA power. I'm not going to pretend to be an AI expert or even competent for that matter. This is very much a learning experience and was initially spun up to use the Nextcloud AI assistant. Right now, it's only set up for text processing, and I'm using a Llama model that supports CUDA, so it's making good use of that GPU. What I've learned so far is that I now understand why you hear about AI machines needing multiple high-end GPUs with plenty of VRAM. This GPU has 8 gigabytes and is barely enough to load in 2 small models. When I was browsing for models to use, there were some that were like 16 or 20 gigabytes. Wild. So yeah, it's pretty cool. It works. I can change models and see how the responses change and stuff, but again, we're learning. Moving on. Oh look, another Ubuntu VM. This time Ubuntu Desktop running Plex. Why? Well, I set up this VM a long time ago and figured it would be easier to just install Plex via the App Store. So I did. And it's in its own VM because I wanted to eventually pass through a GPU to it. After a few years, I'm very much ready to move this thing to Docker and have no real need for a GPU since it doesn't really transcode very much anyway. The last few things aren't used too much. One is my test setup for XCP-ng. I have 2 VMs for this, and with the new 8.1 release, I'll be trying that out more thoroughly. Then I have a Windows VM and a Mac OS VM. You never know when you'll need one, and it's nice to have them for when that reason comes up. Okay, let's keep on keeping on. Next is my highly available cluster. I set this thing up a few months ago with the reasoning that I wanted an HA system and I wanted to start learning about Ceph. This Proxmox HA cluster is composed of 3 identical systems. Since they are in a cluster, their resources are shared, giving me a total of 12 cores, 24 threads, 192 gigabytes of RAM, and 6 terabytes of high-speed storage. On here, I'm running a 3-node K3s Kubernetes cluster and a single Docker VM, all of which is in HA mode, meaning that if the host goes down, that VM is spun up on another node. This all works due to Ceph, which gives us shared storage for the cluster. Since each node can access the same storage and each VM is running on that storage, we have no problems migrating VMs on a host failure. I would go more into Ceph if I knew what the hell I was talking about, but at a high level, it's acting as highly available storage, so 3 drives are pulled together, and then when something is written to that pool, it'll physically write it to at least 2 of the drives, which gives you redundancy on losing a host or a single drive. Okay, Kubernetes. Let me start by saying, I don't think anyone needs Kubernetes in their home lab. It's complex, tedious, a pain to support, and overkill. But man, when it works, it's freaking cool. My 3-node K3s setup is running a single node on each host node. Each node is a control plane and a worker because, why not? My setup isn't that hardcore. And since I'm using K3s, we are controlling everything with Rancher. I'm a pretty big fan of Rancher as it does a solid job of making Kubernetes seem less spooky. In here, I'm not running too much. One is my Jekyll static site that I host all my documentation that I write on a regular basis, and the other is a side project that I'm working on, which is a Node.js API with a MySQL database. All of this is deployed via config files manually and updated manually as well. I'd like to eventually incorporate some automated deployment on Git pushes, but it's one of those things where I have other things I'm more invested in, so this gets kicked down the road. The Docker VM works pretty much the same way in that if the host it's running on goes down, it will automatically be spun up on another one. This is where I have been moving all of my main Docker services to. And here we're running an R stack composed of Sonar, Radar, Prowler, Overseer, and SAB-NZBD. Then we're running Shlink, Nginx Load Balancer, Pihole, Nginx Proxy Manager, Homarr, and Owncast. I'm using my R stack for automatically searching, downloading, and managing all the Linux ISOs and news articles that I use on a daily basis. It's a pretty cool setup, but due to time constraints, I can't really go into too much more detail on those. Moving on, we have a pretty cool service I've been running for a while called Shlink. Basically a URL shortener and tracker that lets you take any link and make it a shortened version using the domain you provide. It'll also track how many times it was clicked, where people are clicking from, what device they're using, and stuff like that. This is pretty useful when I put a link in my videos to have that data available when negotiating with brands. Also, I just like self-hosting a URL shortening service. Now, we already talked about the Nginx load balancer. That just forwards traffic to my K3s cluster, so let's get into Pihole. Everyone knows what Pihole is, so we won't spend too much time here. I'm actually only using Pihole for DNS since Unify's implementation of DNS is absolute butt cheeks. Next is Nginx Proxy Manager, a very important service in my lab. This lets me take all the traffic coming in from Cloudflare and route it to the service it needs to reach on my home lab. When I was running pfSense, I was using the built-in HA proxy plugin, but since Unify doesn't have a reverse proxy, we're using NPM. I have no complaints here. It even has a Let's Encrypt certificate integration, so your data is nice and encrypted while in flight. Then we have Homarr, which is my home lab dashboard tool. I was initially using Heimdall, then I switched to Homarr. Now I'm using Homarr as I think they fixed most of my initial complaints. Plus, it integrates very well with my R stack. I can reach any of my services with a single click, and it even pings them to let me know if they're down. And as you can see, it's showing a lot of things down. This isn't because they're actually down. This is because it's hosted here in the external VLAN, but remember, we only have access to TrueNAS, Plex, and our cluster hosts on the main LAN, so everything else is getting blocked. I can still click and access them from my local machine, but to fix this, I'll either have to allow more connections or move it back to the main LAN. We'll see. This is a really cool little dashboard tool, and I'd recommend you give it a try. The last thing I want to talk about is Owncast. This is a self-hosted streaming server that also spins up a website to view the live stream. It's pretty customizable, but I'm running a bare bones version since it's only for a few people anyway. Owncast will give you an RTMP URL that you plug into your streaming software of choice. Then you can specify what resolutions and bit rates you want your viewer to be able to use. The more transcoding the server has to do, the more resources it's going to use though. I have mine set to not actually do any transcoding at all. There's a setting in there that just passes the stream through directly to the viewer. So as long as you're encoding in something popular like H.264, then you're probably good and there's no resource hit to the server. If you want to be able to easily spin up your own personal streaming page, then consider giving it a try. Now I'm always running more stuff on here to test out, but those are all the services I actually use on a day-to-day basis. Is it a lot? Not at all. I've seen people hosting more things on a Raspberry Pi, but I'm not really in this to have the most proper and efficient home lab. I'm in it to have fun. Okay, so next up is our Synology Systems. I'm running one Synology device locally for backups, then another remotely for remote backups. I really like the Synology ecosystem as I think they pretty much nailed it down when it comes to ease of use. I mentioned that I'm using rsync to get all of my data from my TrueNAS system to the local Synology. This is a pretty simple process that runs daily, and then once the data is stored on the Synology, it can perform snapshots on there so we have some file protection. But for all my personal devices, I'm using Active Backup for Business. This software is freaking awesome. You just install the agent on whatever machine you want to back up, and through the UI on your server, you can select what, when, and how everything is backed up from that device. There's also no need to run snapshots here because it does have built-in versioning with a super easy to use restoration UI. This is also how we are backing up everything remotely too, and the main reason why I switched to Synology. Our remote system is running at my friend's house, and using Active Backup for Business and our OpenVPN server from earlier, we can back up our entire local Synology system to a remote one. I run this twice a week, which is plenty, and honestly, I'm thinking of dropping it back to once a week. Now, this isn't the only way to do this, as there are plenty of different ways to back up your files. The one I used to use is SyncThing, so check that out if you don't want to dive into the Synology ecosystem. There are plenty of other things you can do on these devices since they straight up have VM management and Docker apps, but considering the hardware I already have, let's just stick to letting these do what they do best: store anime. There are a few other things I want to cover here, but I don't really have a cohesive theme to them, so let's just call them miscellaneous. The first being my HL15. At the time of making this video, it's not officially deployed yet, but I'm currently using it to get more familiar with Windows Server. So far, the machine is awesome. Windows Server though, well, you'll see when that video goes live. For security, I'm using Real-Link cameras and their NVR. In the super saturated market that is security cameras, I think Real-Link is up there in terms of quality, features, and price. Are they the absolute best? No, but I've been using them for a while now, and they've been solid. The NVR in all the cameras sit in the IoT VLAN because, well, duh, and I can access them from anywhere via Real-Link's remote connection to the NVR. For my mini PC that sits in my rack to stream through Owncast, I actually have it connected to a tiny Pilot KVM. This lets me control that device from anywhere over the network. This is pretty awesome since it requires no software on the client device, and I can control the device even during boot to access the BIOS. I also have a 4-port KVM that I can hook up downstream and set hotkeys to change the inputs, effectively letting me use the tiny Pilot on 4 separate devices as well. I mentioned before that I have a LAN to VLAN for my Omada setup, and well, here's my Omada setup. I used to run this as my main setup, but as a YouTuber and someone with terrible impulse control, I've changed my network quite a few times over the years. Right now it exists as a test LAN and to keep up with what Omada is doing with their updates. Last but not least is my Zima board cluster. This is essentially a super slimmed down version of my main Proxmox cluster since it's also running as a Proxmox cluster. I use this setup to test the waters to see if I wanted to dive into an HA setup, and as you can tell, I'm now in the deep end convincing myself it was the right choice. While it isn't technically in my home, I still consider my cloud setup part of my home lab too. I'm running a backup/test K3S cluster with American Cloud. I did a whole video showing how I set up everything, but they've been adding features left and right, so that might be dated now. They aren't perfect, but what I really like about them is how simplified everything is to get going. Coming from dabbling in AWS and other VPS services, this is so much better. I spun up a K3S cluster in like 5 minutes and was deploying a minute later. And aside from my personal machines, that's kind of it. Those aren't too exciting. My main machine is a Windows 11 device, and my M1 MacBook runs, well, Mac OS. I like the diversity of using all three, Windows, Mac, and Linux on a day-to-day basis, and while none of them are perfect, I still enjoy using them all. Well, that does it, I think. That's everything I'm running today in my home lab. I know some of it may have been high level, but to make this video not require a Netflix miniseries, I had to glaze over some things. Also, a lot of this stuff I have full videos on, so check the video links in the description below, and if I don't have one, then comment on what you want to see. Do I think my setup is the best? No, but I do think it's solid and it works for me. Will this setup stay the way it is? Hell no. The 2024 version of this video will probably be so much different. That's all I have. If you liked the video, then drop a like. If you want to see more home lab stuff, then subscribe, because it's kind of what I do. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube members and my Patreons. You guys are my super cool VLAN that is isolated, but also has a few traffic rules for special reasons. I don't know where I'm going with that. You guys are the best, and if you're still watching, you're cool too. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.